Hi, and welcome to the presentation of the paper entitled Communicating Cybersecurity Vulnerability Information, a Producer-Acquirer Case Study. My name is Martin Hell and I will be presenting the paper, and this is a joint work with Martin Höst. We are both from Lund University in Sweden. I will start by introducing and motivating the paper. Open source software, abbreviated OSS, is on the rise. In a recent report from GitHub, they say that for JavaScript, 94% of the active repositories use OSS, with a median of 10 direct and almost 700 transitive dependencies in use in the repositories. The National Vulnerability Database, NVD, collects information about vulnerabilities. Looking at the graph, we see that from 2017 to 2020, we've seen an increased number of reported vulnerabilities. In another report from IBM, they state that exploiting vulnerabilities was the top attack vector during 2020, which amounted for 35% of all the incidents that they found. In a typical IoT setting, we often have a producer of the IoT devices, and then we have an acquirer or an integrator of the IoT devices delivering systems. The producer is responsible for creating firmware and responding to the vulnerabilities found in the OSS software, while the acquirer is responsible for installing and updating this firmware. And since both have a shared responsibility when it comes to protecting against the software vulnerabilities, there has to be some way of communicating security and vulnerability information between the producer and the acquirer. The goal of this paper is to understand how considerations regarding vulnerabilities in third-party components arise, are communicated, and are assessed within and between a producer and an acquirer. Specifically, the research questions that we ask here are: first, what roles and responsibilities can be identified? Then, how is vulnerability information communicated within and between the respective organizations? Third question is, what decisions must be made and what information is used? And the final question is, what challenges and opportunities can be identified both within the organizations and in the communication between them? The methodology of our study is an exploratory case study, which means that we try to understand and seek new insights into the situation. It's a qualitative study, so it is based on interviews which are semi-structured. A short overview of the methodology was that we started by defining the research questions. Then in each of the two companies involved in the study, we had a company lead. We adapted and conducted the interviews, and between the interviews we had discussions with the company leads. After that, we analyzed the interviews and we extracted challenges and opportunities that we could identify. For the two companies, we have the producer that produce and sell high-end IoT products. They're in the global B2B business, is about 30 years old and has about 1,000 employees. The acquirer provides high security systems for the customers. They integrate the products into larger systems. The company is about 80 years old and is a very large company with about 100,000 employees. Our study and our questions were based on the following information flow that was validated together with the company leads. In the first step, the questions regarding vulnerabilities arise somewhere in the acquirer's organization. Then the questions are communicated to the producer, and then the questions are communicated to and from the answering role within the producer's organization. In the next step, the answer is communicated back to the acquirer, and then finally the answer is communicated within the acquiring organization. This is the steps taken when the acquirer initiates the question, but you could also have the case where the producer is preemptively sending an answer regarding a vulnerability to the acquirer. And in that case, we start at the fourth step in our communication flow here. We give a very brief summary of the results. For details, you can refer to the paper. On the acquirer side, we have a product owner. Then we have a support team which is working in one country and is serving all the production teams. Every country has its own production team and are serving the end customers in the respective countries. The support team, as centralized in one country, is responsible for identifying and prioritizing vulnerabilities. They get information from two different sources. One is externally produced information, which means that they get information from forums, news, or research articles. They also have internally produced information, which means that they are making their own vulnerability scans against their own network and their own products. When they get an answer from the producer, the support team is responsible for having a meeting and discussing what to do with the different vulnerabilities. The production team, one in each country, offers the integrated system to the customers. The production teams are responsible for deploying the new firmware in case the support team has decided that the new firmware needs to be deployed in case there is a vulnerability. And finally, the product owner is the one defining the requirements for the systems. The product owner, however, is not at all involved in the specific vulnerability discussions. On the producer side, we have first-line support, we have product specialists, we have the software security group, then we have a release team, and then we have a set of development teams. The first-line support is and should always be the entity that receives all the security-related questions. Looking at the questions, they often come in the form of vulnerability scan report, sometimes from a third party like a consultant. In total, there are very few security questions, but they have seen an increase in the number of security questions the last few years. First-line support can typically answer immediately around 70% of the questions, while 30% of the questions has to be escalated to the product specialists. There are also key account managers that use the first-line support for security questions. The first-line support is also the entity that always communicates back the answer of the security-related question after a round trip in the organization. The product specialists are the people with deep knowledge about the products. They answer the questions that first-line support cannot answer. What they do is that they look in their email inbox to see if the question was posed before, and then they can answer immediately. Otherwise, they go, for example, to the National Vulnerability Database and look for information about the specific vulnerabilities. The product specialists are also the people writing the release notes for the new firmware with information about the vulnerabilities that have been patched. The software security group leads the security initiatives within the company. They are doing triage of vulnerabilities that is trying to understand how the specific vulnerabilities affects their specific products. Sometimes they have to answer questions that the product specialist cannot answer. Finally, we have the release team and the development teams. The release team is responsible for making new firmware releases in case of a patched vulnerability, while the development teams are the ones that are updating the open source dependencies to new versions. They also have the responsibility to monitor new vulnerabilities for their own managed components. I also briefly summarized the challenges and opportunities that we have identified. One challenge from the producer side is the scattered knowledge of information. There is no collective or even individual memory of previous answers apart from looking in the email inbox that I was referring to before. Also, the developers often knows about the vulnerabilities already, but this information is often not taken advantage of. One specific statement that we found in our interviews is that this system could break when the company grows or even with growing employee turnover. Another challenge on the producer side is role-targeted security training. For the first-line support, there is not much security training at all, but these are still the ones that receives all the vulnerability-related questions. And sometimes they experience that they maybe panic when vulnerabilities are queried. They also get vulnerability reports as the questions, but they have a very shallow understanding of these vulnerability reports. And finally, a challenge on the acquirer side is that they have a very strong reliance on the producer. They rely on the release notes, and this can be very difficult when you have very many devices, very many different models, and also very many different firmware versions. An opportunity on the producer side would be to leverage internal scan information. The producer is making their own internal vulnerability scans of the product, but the information and the knowledge from these scans is not disseminated within the company. This knowledge could be transferred to first-line support so that they have more and more accurate information about the vulnerabilities that they receive in the vulnerability scans as questions. And finally, an opportunity on the acquirer side would be to register for release notes. If they can receive release notes for the specific models of interest, this could make the information to the acquirer much more relevant. To conclude, we have conducted a case study to understand how vulnerability information is communicated within and between a producing and acquiring organization. We have revealed a set of challenges and opportunities, and even though these are organization specific, they can be considered also for other organizations in order to improve how they work with security. For future work, it would be interesting to understand better how this information fundamentally differs from other information that is communicated, and also to actually implement and evaluate the optimizations that we have identified in our work. Thank you for listening.